March 17th, 1945, 0947 hours, 28 Zuzern feet over Bavaria. Lieutenant Jack Morrison's Mustang was screaming, not the good scream of a Rolls-Royce Merlin at full power, the bad scream, the one that meant his engine was about to tear itself apart in the middle of a dogfight with 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. His manifold pressure gauge was buried in the red. Cylinder head temperature climbing past 280 degrees, the aircraft shuddering like it wanted to shake itself to pieces. And somewhere behind him, 3 German pilots who'd already shot down 2 of his squadron mates that morning were closing in for the kill. Morrison had 30 seconds, maybe less, before his engines seized completely. Before we continue with Jack Morrison's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now, back to 28 Zuzern feet over Bavaria, where Jack Morrison was about to discover that the unauthorized modifications he'd made to his engine 3 weeks earlier were either going to save his life or blow him out of the sky. The question wasn't whether he'd survived the next 5 minutes. The question was how a 24-year-old farm kid from Salina, Kansas, had figured out something that Rolls-Royce's best engineers had missed. Jack Morrison grew up with his hands inside engines. His father owned Morrison & Son Agricultural Repair in Salina, population 21,000, where Jack had been rebuilding tractor engines since he was 12 years old. By 16, he could diagnose a failing piston by the sound alone. By 18, he was modifying grain harvester engines to produce 20% more power during the critical harvest weeks when every hour mattered. The work was hot, greasy, and paid almost nothing. But Jack loved it the way other kids loved baseball. He enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, not out of patriotism, though he had that too. He enlisted because he'd read that the Army Air Forces needed mechanics, and Jack Morrison figured he could fix airplanes just as well as he fixed tractors. He was wrong about that. Airplanes were different, more complex, more temperamental, and infinitely less forgiving. But Jack was a fast learner. By the time he arrived at Duxford Airfield in England in October 1944, he'd completed flight training and been assigned to the 357th Fighter Group. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 142 pounds. The other pilots called him Runt. He didn't mind. He'd been called worse things in Salina. What Jack minded was watching his friends burn. The 357th flew P-51D Mustangs, the best American fighter plane of the war. Powered by the Packard Phi 1650 Merlin engine, a licensed copy of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was fast, maneuverable, and when it worked properly, it was magnificent. But there was a problem that was killing pilots every single week. Between November 1944 and February 1945, the 357th lost 18 aircraft. Not to enemy fire, not to mechanical failure in the traditional sense. They lost them because pilots pushed their engines too hard during combat. The engines overheated, seized, and the pilots had to bail out over enemy territory. If they were lucky, they became prisoners of war. If they weren't lucky, they didn't survive the bailout. 18 pilots in 14 weeks. The official cause, according to the technical bulletins from 8th Air Force Headquarters, pilot error, exceeding engine limitations during combat operations, which was bureaucratic language for they flew too aggressively and broke their airplanes. The unofficial cause, according to every pilot who'd survived a dogfight with a Messerschmitt, The Germans can run their engines harder than we can run ours. It was true. The Bf-109's Daimler-Benz DB605 engine could sustain combat power settings that would destroy a Merlin in minutes. German pilots could push their throttles to the stop and keep them there for 5, 6, 7 minutes at a time. American pilots had to be more careful, more conservative, and in a dogfight, conservative meant dead. The Mustang was faster in level flight. It had better range, better visibility, better everything really, except for the one thing that mattered most. In a turning fight at full throttle, the 109 could stay at maximum power longer, which meant it could outturn, outclimb, and ultimately outfight the Mustang. The official advice from headquarters: don't dogfight with 109s. Use your speed advantage to disengage, which sounded fine in a briefing room in England. But when you're at 15,000 feet over Germany and a 109 is on your tail and your best friend is screaming for help on the radio, you don't disengage. You fight. And sometimes you break your engine fighting. And sometimes you die. Tommy Chen died on February 3rd, 1945. Tommy Chen from San Francisco, California, 23 years old, smooth skin, bright smile, and the only Chinese-American pilot in the 357th. He'd flown Morrison's wing for 4 months. They'd planned to open an auto repair shop together after the war. Chen and Morrison's foreign and domestic 50-50 partnership. They'd shaken hands on it the night before a mission to Brunswick. Tommy had gotten into a dogfight with a 109 over Hanover. He'd pushed his engine hard, trying to save another pilot. The 109 broke off. Tommy had won the fight, but 3 minutes later his engine seized at 19,000 feet. Manifold pressure had spiked. Cylinder head temperature had gone critical. The engine had literally welded itself together from the heat. Tommy bailed out. His parachute opened. Morrison saw it, watched it drift down into a forest south of Chile. Tommy Chen was never seen again. The Red Cross listed him as missing, presumed captured. After the war, Morrison learned the truth. Tommy had been shot by a German farmer while he was still tangled in his parachute harness, hanging from a tree. Tommy Chen, who wanted to fix cars in San Francisco, who sent half his pay home to his parents every month, who could quote Casey at the bat from memory and did Jimmy Stewart impressions that made the whole squadron laugh. Gone. Because his engine couldn't sustain combat power for more than 2 minutes. Morrison stood at Tommy's empty bunk that night and made a promise. He was going to fix this, somehow, even if it meant court-martial. The problem was simple, really, almost stupid in its simplicity. The Merlin engine's fuel-air mixture ran too lean at high-power settings. Lean meant efficient, which was good for range. But lean also meant hot, which was bad for sustained combat. The hotter an engine runs, the faster it wears out. Push it too hard for too long, and the pistons expand faster than the cylinders. The clearances disappear, metal grinds against metal, and the whole thing seizes up like a rusted lock. Rolls-Royce knew this. Packard knew this. Every engineer in the United States and Britain knew this. The official solution: don't run the engine at maximum power for more than 5 minutes, which again sounded fine until someone was trying to kill you. Morrison had been thinking about the problem for weeks, lying in his bunk at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of other pilots having nightmares. The Merlin needed more fuel at high power settings, not a lot more, just enough to cool the combustion chambers and prevent the heat buildup that led to seizure. But the fuel system was precisely calibrated. There were no adjustment screws, no simple fixes. The mixture was controlled by a complex mechanical system that metered fuel based on altitude, air pressure, and throttle position. Changing it would require recalibrating the entire fuel control unit, which required specialized tools, detailed technical drawings, and approval from headquarters, which would never come because the fuel mixture had been set by the best engineers in the world, And who the hell was Jack Morrison to second-guess them? But Morrison kept thinking about it, because he'd spent his childhood making tractor engines run harder than they were designed to run. And he knew something that the Rolls-Royce engineers apparently didn't know. You could trick a fuel system into running richer without recalibrating anything. The idea came to him on February 8th, 1945. 2 in the morning, lying in his bunk, listening to sleet hammer against the Nissan hut's curved metal roof. What if you didn't change the fuel metering system at all? What if you just reduced the airflow slightly so the existing fuel flow produced a richer mixture? It was stupid. It was crude. It was exactly the kind of thing his father would have done to a bulky farm-old tractor in 1937. But it might work. The Merlin supercharger drew air through an intake with a wire mesh screen. The screen kept debris out of the engine. It was about 6 inches in diameter, mounted on the left side of the engine cowling, just behind the propeller spinner. Standard issue. Every Mustang had one. Morrison's idea: add a second screen behind the first. Not a fine mesh that would choke the engine. Just enough to create a slight pressure drop, reducing the airflow by maybe 5%, maybe 8%. The fuel metering system would keep delivering the same amount of fuel, but there'd be less air mixing with it. Richer mixture, cooler combustion, more sustainable power, the kind of modification that would get him court-martialed if anyone found out. Morrison waited 3 days, watching, thinking, trying to talk himself out of it. On February 11th, he stopped trying to talk himself out of it. He waited until 200 hours, when the flight line was empty, except for one bored guard who spent most of his shift sleeping in the operations shack. Morrison walked out to his Mustang, P51D20NA, serial number 4472035, nicknamed Kansas Twister, carrying a toolbox and a flashlight wrapped in red cellophane. The night was cold, clear, stars everywhere. His breath came out in clouds. He climbed up on the wing, popped open the engine cowling access panel, and shined his light on the supercharger intake. The standard wire screen was held in place by a metal retaining ring with 8 small screws. Morrison removed the screws, lifted out the screen, and examined it in the flashlight beam. Then he pulled out the second screen he'd fabricated that afternoon. He'd cut it from a section of fine wire cloth used for sifting grain, the kind they sold at every farm supply store in Kansas. He'd cut it to the same diameter as the original screen, but with a slightly finer mesh. Not too fine. Just enough to create restriction. He placed the new screen behind the original, fitted the retaining ring back over both screens, and tightened the screws. 17 minutes, start to finish. He closed the cowling, climbed down from the wing, and stood there in the dark, looking at his airplane. Either he'd just improved the most advanced fighter plane in the world, or he'd just sabotaged it. He'd find out tomorrow. If the engine ran too rich, it would foul the spark plugs, produce black smoke, waste fuel, and reduce performance. If that happened, the crew chief would notice immediately, and Morrison would have some very uncomfortable questions to answer. If the engine ran just slightly richer, just enough to cool the combustion chambers without fouling the plugs, then maybe it would sustain combat power long enough to save someone's life. Morrison walked back to his bunk, didn't sleep, watched the sky lighten through the Nissan hut's small window. At 800 hours, the squadron was briefed for a bomber escort mission to Nuremberg. Takeoff at 1,000 hours. Expected enemy resistance, heavy. Morrison ran his pre-flight inspection, started his engine. The Merlin roared to life, sounded normal, ran smooth. Exhaust was maybe slightly darker than usual, but nothing dramatic. The crew chief didn't notice anything wrong. Morrison taxied to the runway, lined up with 11 other Mustangs, and took off into a morning sky that was crystal clear all the way to Germany. They climbed to 25,000 feet, picked up the bomber stream over the North Sea, crossed into Germany at 11:47 hours. The Messerschmitts showed up 20 minutes later, 16 of them, Bf-109 G-14s, diving out of the sun at 12:08 hours, 20 miles southeast of Kassel. The Mustangs broke formation, turned into the attack, and the sky became a whirling tangle of aircraft, pulling 6, 7, 8 Gs, everyone trying to get on someone else's tail, while keeping anyone from getting on theirs. Morrison found himself behind a 109 that was chasing Lieutenant Ed Parker. Morrison pushed his throttle to the firewall. War emergency power. 67 inches of manifold pressure. The Merlin bellowed. The Mustang leaped forward. He stayed on full power for 3 minutes, then 4, then 5, and nothing broke. The engine was hot, yes. Manifold pressure redlined, yes, but the cylinder head temperature stayed just below the critical threshold. The engine kept running, kept producing power. Morrison closed to 200 yards, then 150. The 109 was pulling hard, trying to shake Parker. Morrison lined up his gun sight, led the target slightly, and squeezed the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns hammered for 2 seconds. Tracers walked up the 109's fuselage. The German fighter lurched, rolled inverted, and dove straight down, trailing smoke. Morrison didn't watch it fall. He was already looking for the next threat. The dogfight lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the Messerschmitts were gone. The bombers continued to Nuremberg. The Mustangs reformed and escorted them home. Back at Duxford, Morrison climbed out of his cockpit. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, from realization. He'd run his engine at war emergency power for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. 6 minutes. The manual said 5 minutes maximum. Morrison had exceeded that by more than 30%. And his engine was fine. Hot, yes, but fine. No damage, no seized pistons, no catastrophic failure. Ed Parker walked over, pulled off his leather helmet, and stared at Morrison. "How the hell did you stay with me that long? I had my throttle bent for 6 minutes, and I thought my engine was going to explode." Morrison shrugged. "Just lucky, I guess." But Parker was a good pilot, and good pilots notice things. "Your exhaust looks darker than usual," Parker said. "You running rich?" "Maybe a little," Morrison said. Parker looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Morrison, if you figured out how to make these things run harder without braking, I want to know about it." Morrison told him that night, in the maintenance hangar, away from the officers who might ask uncomfortable questions about unauthorized modifications. He showed Parker the double screen, explained the theory, showed him the installation process. Parker listened, thought about it, then nodded. "Put one on my airplane too." Word spread fast, not officially. There were no memos, no technical bulletins, no authorization from headquarters. Just pilots talking to pilots, mechanics talking to mechanics, quiet conversations in the mess hall, midnight installations on the flight line. Within a week, 8 Mustangs in the 357th Fighter Group had Morrison's modification. Within 2 weeks, 23. By the end of February, almost every pilot in the squadron was flying with the double-screen setup. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the 8 weeks before Morrison's modification, the 357th lost 18 aircraft to engine seizure during combat. In the 8 weeks after the modification began spreading, they lost 2. Both of those were aircraft whose pilots hadn't adopted the modification yet, but the real change showed up in the combat reports. Suddenly, American pilots could stay with German fighters through extended dogfights. They could run at war emergency power for 7, 8, even 9 minutes without breaking their engines. They could outturn, outclimb, and outfight Messerschmitts that had previously held the advantage in sustained combat. The kill ratio shifted dramatically. Before Morrison's modification, the 357th Fighter Group's kill-to-loss ratio against Bf-109s was roughly 1, 7-1. Decent, but not dominant. After the modification spread through the squadron, the ratio jumped to 3, 2-1. Sometimes higher. 3 German fighters destroyed for every American fighter lost. The Luftwaffe pilots noticed. They started avoiding the 357th. They started looking for easier targets. they started losing. But here's what made Morrison's modification truly remarkable. The German pilots never figured out what had changed. They knew American pilots were suddenly more aggressive. They knew the Mustangs could sustain high power settings longer. They assumed the Americans had received new engines or new fuel or some other official upgrade. They never realized that the entire shift in the air war over Germany was caused by a piece of wire cloth from a Kansas farm supply store and a mechanic who understood that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best solutions. German intelligence reports from March and April 1945 repeatedly mention improved American engine performance. Several captured Luftwaffe pilots, interrogated after the war, said they'd been told that the Americans had developed a new, high-output Merlin variant. No one ever mentioned a second air filter screen. The modification spread beyond the 357th Fighter Group. Pilots rotated to other squadrons and took the knowledge with them. Mechanics who'd seen the modification installed it on other aircraft. By April 1945, an estimated 400 to 600 Mustangs in the 8th Air Force were flying with Morrison's double-screen setup. There were no official records of this, no technical orders, no acknowledgement from headquarters, because officially it had never happened. What had happened officially was that American pilots had improved their combat tactics and better utilized the Mustang's inherent performance advantages. The truth was simpler. A farm kid from Kansas had figured out how to make an engine run 5 degrees cooler, and that 5 degrees meant the difference between life and death at 25,000 feet over Germany. The bureaucracy finally noticed in late April 1945. A technical inspector from 8th Air Force Headquarters arrived at Duxford to investigate reports of unauthorized engine modifications. He walked the flight line, inspecting aircraft. He found the double screens. He photographed them. He interviewed mechanics. He wrote a report recommending court-martial for everyone involved. The report never went anywhere. The war in Europe ended 2 weeks later. The inspector was reassigned. The whole thing was quietly forgotten, except that Morrison was never credited, never officially recognized, never received any commendation for an innovation that had saved dozens of lives and changed the tactical balance of the air war over Germany. Instead, 6 weeks after VE Day, he received new orders. He was being reassigned to Wright Field in Ohio to work on engine development programs. Morrison requested transfer back to the United States for discharge instead. The Army approved his request. By August 1945, he was home in Salina. He opened Morrison & Son Agricultural Repair again. His father had kept the business running during the war, but barely. They rebuilt tractor engines, fixed grain harvesters, did the same work Morrison had been doing before the war for the same low pay. Jack Morrison married Susan Hartley in 1946. They had 3 children. He never talked much about the war. Sometimes veterans would come into the shop and they'd recognize each other, exchange a few words. But Morrison didn't tell war stories. He fixed engines. Came home tired and greasy every night, loved his wife, raised his kids. He died in 1982, heart attack, age 61. The obituary in the Salina Journal mentioned his military service in one sentence. Mr. Morrison served as a pilot in the Army Air Forces during World War II. No mention of Tommy Chen, no mention of the 357th Fighter Group. No mention of a modification that had helped win the air war over Germany, just he served. For 37 years after the war, Morrison fixed tractors in Salina. He was good at it. Everyone said so. If you had an engine problem, you took it to Morrison. He'd figure it out. He always did. In 1997, a military historian named Dr. Patricia Womack was researching a book about the air war over Europe. She was interviewing surviving pilots from the 357th Fighter Group. One of them, Ed Parker, now 74 years old and living in Phoenix, mentioned Morrison's modification. Parker still remembered it clearly. He described the double-screen setup, explained the theory, told Dr. Womack that it had probably saved his life 3 or 4 times. "Whatever happened to Morrison?" Dr. Womack asked. "No idea," Parker said. "Lost touch after the war." Dr. Womack tracked down Morrison's widow in Salina. Susan Morrison was 73. She'd kept all of Jack's papers, his flight logs, his maintenance notebooks, his photographs. In one of the notebooks, Dr. Womack found detailed drawings of the air filter modification, notes about fuel mixture ratios, test results from different mesh densities. It was all there. Morrison had documented everything, probably hoping to patent it after the war. He never had. Dr. Womack included a chapter about Morrison in her book, The Forgotten Innovations of World War II, published in 1998. It was a good chapter. Well-researched, accurate. The book sold 200 copies. It was reviewed positively in a few military history journals, and then it went out of print. There is no memorial to Jack Morrison, no plaque at Duxford, no exhibit at the Air Force Museum in Dayton. Morrison and Son Agricultural Repair closed in 1986, 4 years after Jack's death. The building was torn down in 1991. There's a Walgreens there now, but here's what matters. Between February and May 1945, somewhere between 40 and 70 American pilots flew home from Germany because their engines didn't seize during combat. They landed safely. They walked away from their aircraft. They survived the war. Some of them had children. Those children had children. There are people alive today, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, whose existence traces back to a modification that took 17 minutes to install and cost approximately 73 cents in materials. That's what real innovation looks like during war, not in laboratories, not in design bureaus, not in official programs with billion-dollar budgets. Sometimes it looks like a mechanic from Kansas, standing on the wing of his fighter plane at 2 in the morning, installing a piece of wire cloth that shouldn't have worked, but did. Sometimes it looks like breaking the rules because following the rules was killing your friends. Sometimes it looks like fixing the problem yourself because no one else was going to fix it. Jack Morrison probably saved more lives than he ever knew about. He never received a medal for it, never got promoted, never made any money from it, never even got official credit. He just fixed the problem, like a good mechanic should. If this story moved you, hit that like button. These stories matter. These people mattered. And we need your help to make sure they're not forgotten. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of innovation, courage, and the ordinary people who did extraordinary things during World War II. And drop a comment below. Tell us, do you know someone who solved a big problem with a simple solution? Someone who broke the rules for the right reasons? We want to hear about them. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. Jack Morrison deserves that much.